Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I'm joined by Christoph.
Hey, Dale. So good to be here again. I'm looking forward to learning more today.
Today, we shift our attention to a lesser-known but remarkably daring episode from the Mediterranean theater of WW2. We'll tell the story of the raid on Algiers, when Italian frogmen and manned torpedoes struck at Allied shipping in the harbor of Algiers on December 11th, 1942.
Manned torpedoes?
This isn't a story of massive fleets or grand battles. It's a story of silence, stealth, and cunning. It's a story of men willing to risk everything under cover of darkness. And it's a story that reveals how vulnerable Allied supply and naval operations remained even after major offenses elsewhere. By December 1942, the Allies had already launched Operation Torch, the massive Allied invasion of French North Africa that began in November and included landings in Morocco, Oran, and Algiers. Algiers harbor at that moment was Allied cargo ships, transports, and supply vessels had been making their way through the Mediterranean to support the campaign. The harbor's strategic value was enormous. It was a gateway for supplies, men, and material heading deeper into North Africa, towards Tunisia, and eventually across the Mediterranean. For the Axis powers, already squeezed on multiple fronts, disrupting those supply lines could yield significant leverage. And this is where the concept of manned torpedoes, attacks, and combat frogmen came into play. The operation was carried out by the Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, using its elite commando unit, Decima Tiglia. Their chosen delivery platform was the submarine Umbra, under the command of Mario Aurelio. On December 4th, 1942, Umbra departed from La Spezia with 3 manned torpedoes and 10 highly trained commando divers on board. Their target? The harbor at Algiers, where intelligence identified a concentration of Allied merchant and supply ships ripe for attack. The plan was audacious. Infiltrate the harbor under cover of darkness. Attach limpet mines or torpedoes to Allied ships. Then escape unnoticed. At first glance, a small-scale raid like this might look minor compared to grand fleet engagements or massive land invasions, but its implications were anything but small. 1. Success meant significant disruption to the Allied supply lines at a critical juncture in North Africa. Several merchant and cargo ships meant fuel, ammunition, food, supplies vital to the advancing Allied armies. 2. For the attackers, it demonstrated that even after major losses and attacks elsewhere, the Regia Marina retained capacity for bold, clandestine operations. 3. For the Allied side, it highlighted a continuing vulnerability. Even when escort ships, naval patrols, and air cover were in place, no harbor was completely safe, especially at night under the sea. The raid on Algiers is a reminder that in war, not all victories are won by battleships or grand strategies. Some are won or lost in silence and darkness.
I never really thought about the complications of getting Allied troops to North Africa. I know that we had a North Africa campaign, and I know that Italy was part of the Axis powers, and as a huge peninsula sticking out into the Mediterranean, they could cause issues. Never put that together. My maternal grandfather was actually an artilleryman in the North Africa campaign for the French military. And so this is very interesting to me to see how this unfolds and to see what each side does to counter the other. I rarely hear about the Italian Navy, but I think mostly because they're boxed into the Mediterranean by the British. And so I'm curious to see how this unfolds.
When you read about the raid on Algiers, the image that often comes to mind is dramatic. Italian frogmen slipping beneath the waves, carrying limpet mines or man torpedoes, sneaking into a heavily defended harbor under the cover of darkness. But behind that image was a meticulously planned mission, the kind of operation that leaves almost no room for error. We're going to trace that infiltration, how the Italian submarine, the men on board, and the darkness itself came together to make the raid possible. The strike force originated with the Italian submarine Ambra. On December 4th, 1942, she departed from La Spezia, carrying 3 manned torpedoes, known as SLC Maiali, or slow-running torpedoes, and a contingent of commando frogmen from the Italian elite Special Operations Unit. This was not the first time the Ambra had been used for such raids. The concept of deploying human torpedoes and combat divers was a specialization of the Decima Mas, which had already carried out operations earlier in the war. But operating in the Western Mediterranean, delivering men and machines into a well-defended Allied harbor, was exceptionally dangerous and extremely delicate. The cargo on deck and inside the Ambra included sealed cylinders housing the SLCs, plus the breathers, diving gear, limpet mines, and other equipment needed by the frogmen. The men on board were highly trained, disciplined, and prepared to carry out sabotage under the most perilous conditions. After leaving on December 4th, Ambra made her way towards the Algerian coast. By the evening of December 10th, she was in position to begin the final phase of the operation. But rough seas, strong patrol presence, and the need for absolute stealth forced the Italians to wait. Only when conditions improved, when the sea was calmer and sentinel patrols less intense, did they begin the infiltration. Submerged, Ambra navigated towards Algiers harbor at night. To avoid detection, she hugged the seafloor. According to Italian sources, on one attempt she struck bottom. The echo sounder was malfunctioning, causing a dangerous unintended grounding near 90 meters. She then slowly adjusted and moved up to about 18 meters depth, where she could proceed more cautiously. At around 21:45 on the night of December 10th, one of the commando frogmen, acting as a surface scout, emerged from the submarine. Using a telephone connection, he reported spotting 6 steamers anchored within the harbor. He provided their positions to the submarine commander. This information set the stage. The frogmen and man torpedoes, their mission had begun. At about 23:45, some hours after the scout's initial sighting, the other frogmen and the SLCs began to emerge. The delay had been caused by careful timing and perhaps concerns over patrols or environmental conditions. They slipped through the dark waters, moving slowly, silently towards their targets. Their mission: place limpet mines or explosive charges on anchored Allied ships, cargo and supply vessels, without lighting a match, without alerting harbor defenses, without making a sound that could draw attention. According to the standard method of the Decima Mas, once the limpet mines were placed, the frogmen were to retreat, meet again with the submarine at a prearranged recovery point, and escape beneath the waves. But Algiers harbor was not undefended. Several sources report a strong reaction from harbor defenses when the infiltration began. One account notes, quote, intense reaction from harbor defenses once disturbance was detected. Even with the defenses alerted, the frogmen pressed on. They worked in the darkness amid anchored hulks, mooring lines, nets, and anti-submarine measures. Each placement of a mine was a gamble. Success meant a valuable Allied ship destroyed. Failure meant capture or death. Originally, the plan anticipated recovery of the commandos by 0200. Due to complications, perhaps evasive maneuvers by guards, currents, or mechanical issues, the submarine could only attempt recovery at 0300, an hour later. By then, the scout was recalled aboard, and the Umbra began to withdraw into the night. Unbeknownst to Umbra, at that moment, the sabotage was already set in motion. As the submarine slipped away, the waiting began. At approximately 0500 on the morning of December 11th, explosions rocked the harbor. The sabotage charges went off, tearing into the hulls of anchored ships. The effects were severe. The Norwegian cargo ship Berta was sunk. 3 other Allied vessels were badly damaged. The British cargo ship Ocean Vanquisher, Empire Centaur, and Armatin. One source notes they were severely damaged, some needing to be beached to avoid sinking. According to some reports, an American landing ship, LSM-59, was left stranded on a beach after being damaged in the raid, though some accounts do vary on this detail. The raid was, thus, by objective measure, a success. Significant tonnage was lost, and Allied supply capacity in Algiers harbor was disrupted at a moment when North Africa was a critical theater. Despite the success, the entire commando team, all the frogmen, and LSC crews who infiltrated the harbor were ultimately captured. According to records, 16 Italian operators were taken prisoner after the attack. Their capture underscores a brutal reality of such raids. Even a successful sabotage could end with imprisonment. But for the Allies, the port authorities, Royal Navy, and Allied Naval Command, the damage had already been done. The harbor defenses would be analyzed and reinforced. Convoy planners and supply officers would have to adjust. The war in the Mediterranean had become even more dangerous for shipping.
Yeah, there's a couple things that you're making me think of. And you mentioned the term frogmen a couple of times. And I realize that I really haven't heard that term in ages. So I don't know if, like, our younger listeners would be familiar with what that is. But from what I understand, it's basically when you think of like a proto-Navy SEAL type. Basically, you've got the scuba tanks, the fins, the goggles, and maybe some undersea weapon of sorts. Think of the battle scene in Thunderball. Those are all frogmen. Maybe not scuba tanks. I don't know if that was as popularized at that time. Maybe snorkels. But anyway, it's we're going to go in the water, and then we're going to board secretly. That was their whole thing. Additionally, when you were describing the attack by the Italians and the patience that was required and the limitations in how they could pick up the scouts, all of that is very reminiscent of many of our other episodes where you describe a Japanese submarine or a German submarine. They could not fight in the open. It was all stealth. And then when you said the name of the submarine, I'm like, my Latin is rusty, but I think that means shadow. I was like, oh, what a perfectly named ship. And I don't know. The Mediterranean has also been a scene of naval warfare for millennia. So this is just extending that tradition. The Norwegian shipping vessel was surprising to me that it was sunk because I think Norway was occupied at this time by the Germans. I don't know if they were occupied by now, but I know the occupation lasted until 1945, and so I'm not sure what the deal was as far as if they were supplying Allied materials or if it was a renegade Norwegian. Like their king was in exile. I think it couldn't have been Paris. It must have been London. Anyway, there's a lot going on here. And that's probably why I'm having such a hard time conveying one coherent message. But as with most of World War II, there's a lot of dynamics and a lot of nuance. And I'm very glad that you're highlighting some of the specifics so we can feel what those men had to go through and what they had to be concerned about and how they had to approach matters and the defenses that they had to install to prevent all kinds of things.
The occupation of Norway finished on June 10th, 1940.
Okay. I was under
But
the impression
also,
it lasted until 45. I'm learning something all the time.
it was Germany got control of Norway June 10th, 1940.
Oh, that's when they
And it was,
that's when they
and
started.
it was occupied until May 8th, 1945.
Wow. Okay. There we go.
So, yes, Norway is occupied at this point in time, but that doesn't mean that Germany has control of all of her assets.
Right.
If a Norwegian ship was at sea during the occupation, then Allied command would take control of
I see.
that
Or at
boat
least
and keep
convince
using
them,
it.
hey, would you like to fight against the nation that is occupying your country currently? Answer is probably
And,
yes.
and just because it's owned by Norway doesn't mean that it was manned by Norwegians as well.
Yeah. And so it's details like that that I think are important for the listener and myself to keep in mind when we're hearing stories like this. It's like, why did that happen? There's a lot of different reasons why that could happen.
When dawn broke over Algiers on December 11th, 1942, the city should have been waking to another busy morning. Harbor cranes, cargo crews, the bustle of sailors, soldiers, and stevedores rushing supplies towards the fighting in Tunisia. Instead, the early morning was shattered by the deep, echoing concussion of explosions rolling across the port. Many Allied sailors later described feeling the harbor floor tremble beneath their ships. These explosions were, of course, the mines set hours earlier by the Italian frogmen. The first and most immediate reaction from the Allied sailors and harbor guards was confusion. Some thought a ship's boiler had blown. Others' depth charge had accidentally detonated. A few suspected sabotage instantly. The harbor had already been on alert for weeks due to Axis air raids and submarine threats. But within minutes, as smoke began to rise from multiple moorings, officers realized this was no accident. One of the closest ships to the blast, the Norwegian cargo vessel Bertha, was struck with devastating effectiveness. She took on water rapidly and settled by the bow. Allied sailors nearby described hearing crewmen shouting that compartments were flooding faster than pumps could keep up. Despite efforts to save her, Bertha sank at her moorings. She would later be declared a total loss. The blasts also ripped into 3 major British merchant ships. Again, the Ocean Vanquisher, the Empire Centaur, and the Armatan. All 3 were critical cargo carriers supporting the Allied push east from Algiers towards Tunis and Bizerte. Harbor logs describe severe structural damage and progressive flooding. Crews scrambled to shore up bulkheads, shore timbers, and in some cases run ships aground deliberately to prevent capsizing, a standard emergency measure when a vessel is struck in shallow harbor. One British sailor later said the shockwave felt like being hit by a train underwater. Shortly after the blasts, divers and patrol boats swept the harbor for clues. Pieces of metal, consistent with limpet mine fragments, were recovered. It became clear the port had been infiltrated by underwater saboteurs, nearly unheard of in the Western Mediterranean. Within hours, shore defenses across the port were increased. Patrol boats began continuous sweeps. Floodlights probed the water. Anti-frogman nets were inspected and reinforced. Armed guards were posted at every jetty and pierhead. Word spread quickly that Italian frogmen were likely responsible. One Royal Navy lieutenant wrote in a report that morning, "We did not know where they had come from, nor how they had gotten in, only that they had gotten out again, and that was cause for concern. The damage came at a delicate moment. Allied forces were fighting through Tunisia, trying to seize the decisive upper hand. Supplies were essential, especially fuel, ammunition, and spare parts for columns. Every cargo ship counted. Algiers was one of the logistical hearts of the Allied operation. An attack here was not just a blow to shipping tonnage, it was a blow to strategic momentum. Senior officers in the harbor, both Royal Navy and U.S. Navy, held immediate briefings. The emerging picture suggested a coordinated underwater sabotage mission, likely delivered by a submarine, highly trained personnel involved, not amateurs or local saboteurs. Rear Admiral Harold Burrow, overseeing naval operations in the area, ordered a full sweep of the approaches to Algiers to search for a lurking submarine. None was found. Umbra had already withdrawn under cover of night. Many sailors in the harbor expressed disbelief that divers could infiltrate a port as heavily used and patrolled as Algiers. Supplies had been moving consistently. Watchstanders were tired. Air raids from earlier weeks had stressed everyone. But underwater infiltration? That was new. A U.S. Army cargo handling officer later recalled, "We were used to planes. We were used to submarines at sea. But divers in the harbor? It shook people. You started looking over the rails into the water like it had teeth." A British petty officer put it more bluntly. "It made us feel naked." Throughout the day, Allied patrols scoured the coastline and breakwaters for signs of survivors or saboteurs. And one by one, the Italian commandos were discovered. Some were found exhausted, washed onto beaches by currents. Others were hiding near the harbor's edge, hoping to evade capture and make a rendezvous that would never come. A few were found semi-conscious from cold and exhaustion after hours spent in the water. In total, 16 Italian operatives were captured, including both the frogmen and the crews of the manned torpedoes. Reports indicate that most surrendered without resistance. Some were so fatigued and chilled they could barely speak. One Allied officer, upon seeing their gear, supposedly remarked, "These men had no intention of coming back alive, did they?" He was not far off the mark. The raid was, by every operational measure, tactically successful, strategically disruptive, psychologically jarring, and executed with bravery and skill. But all the Italian operators were captured. None returned home. The Umbra escaped, but her passengers, the men who had risked everything, became prisoners of war. And yet, despite their capture, the damage they inflicted was undeniable. In internal reports, Allied naval officers acknowledged the raid had been well executed. One classified British report concluded, "The enemy had demonstrated capacity and underwater penetration that must be considered in all future harbor defenses." It was a rare acknowledgement of Axis naval ingenuity, and a warning that more such attacks could follow.
As you were describing the process of them attacking, how new it was, really that's the focus of what I kept coming back to. I've played a lot of video games in my life, and a lot of them entail different operations of different military type. And so this doesn't seem new, but I'm looking at it with the lens of today. In World War II, submarines weren't new, but the way they were being employed was new. And I think there were so many technologies and strategies that came about during this time where they were new and they didn't know how to take into account these dangers. And like we said, they were used to planes. That was a fairly new technology as well that advanced very quickly. They knew what to expect there. They knew about submarines at sea. That has been happening since World War I. But this was new. And trying to put myself in the mindset of seeing that type of thing for the first time, a saboteur that sneaks into your harbor, and then trying to come up with How do we stop that? That had to have taken a lot of thinking and creativity, strategy. That it's hard to know how to react or respond to a new threat like this that could potentially be devastating. If Algiers was as much of a key pipeline as you were describing, this could completely derail the Allied war effort. And so there were a lot of folks, I'm sure, that had to put their heads together and say, we need to make sure this doesn't happen. And hopefully, I guess I may have missed the extent of the damage of the saboteurs. I know there were a few ships, at least one ship that was sunk, but it could have been much more widespread and persistent. But I want to continue and keep listening to see what the response was by the Allies. That's where my head's at right now.
To understand the raid on Algiers fully, we have to look more closely at the men who carried it out. It's easy to think of them simply as enemy divers or sabotage teams, but that barely scratches the surface. These were not ordinary sailors. They belonged to one of the most specialized and dangerous units of the entire war. Italy's elite naval assault group. And the story of this raid becomes a very different one when you understand the people behind it. Decima wasn't formed from conscripts or pressed service. These were volunteers. They wanted to be there, and they knew exactly what they were signing up for. Their missions were so dangerous that the survival rate for major operations was often low. They trained under harsh conditions, spending long hours in cold water, practicing stealth underwater approaches, and learning how to use manned torpedoes, devices that were equally parts weapon, transportation, and death trap. One Italian historian once wrote that Decima men were closer to divers and stuntmen than traditional sailors. They had to be calm under pressure, patient, physically resilient, and mentally unshakable. Much of the training revolved around long underwater swims, navigation in darkness, operating the human torpedoes, setting limpet mines silently, evading harbor defenses and nets, and remaining nearly motionless for long periods. The Italian Navy treated these men as a precious tool. Their missions depended on stealth, discipline, and absolute silence. One former Decima operator described training dives where they practiced removing and replacing mines in pitch blackness. Quote, your heartbeat was louder than the water. Motivations varied for why they volunteered. Some were patriots devoted to Italy's war effort. Some were adventurers drawn to the high-risk nature of the missions. Some saw it as the elite of the elite, a chance to rise above the rigid hierarchy of the regular Navy. And others viewed their work as a challenge, a test of endurance and courage. Whatever the personal reason, what bound them together was commitment. They knew the odds, they knew the risks, and yet they kept volunteering. From the Italian perspective, the raid on Algiers was not just another sabotage attempt. It was a chance to strike a meaningful blow at a moment when Italy's position was weakening. The North African campaign was turning against the Axis. Supplies were scarce. Troop morale was strained. Every disruption of Allied logistics was viewed as vital. For the raiders aboard the submarine, Umbra, reaching Algiers meant days confined in tight quarters, sleeping among torpedo tubes and equipment, preparing gear repeatedly, reviewing charts, mentally rehearsing their escape, and trying to remain calm as hours stretched into days. One Italian account mentions the men sitting quietly before deployment, checking their gear over and over while the submarine crept along the seabed. No one spoke unless necessary. Silence was essential and heavy. It's easy to imagine these raiders as fearless superhumans, but they were not. They felt fear. They felt tension. They felt isolation. One later wrote in a memoir, "There's a moment when you climb out of the submarine into the black water, and you know your life is no longer yours." Another described the shock of cold during the initial descent as a slap from the sea to remind you she does not care for your plans. But they kept moving because their mission depended on it. The manned torpedoes used in the raid were officially designated SLCs, but sailors nicknamed them Mayali, or pigs. Now, because they were notoriously difficult to maneuver and often malfunctioned. Imagine sitting astride a slow-moving torpedo, guiding it by hand in total darkness, trying to keep it steady, all while cold water seeps through every layer of your gear. Operating one required absolute control of breathing, fine motor coordination despite numb hands, navigating by touch and instinct, remaining calm while compressed air hissed around you, and keeping track of time, depth, and position. These raiders were trained for months for missions that lasted only a few hours. Once the frogmen placed their charges, the next step was escape. Ideally, they would rendezvous with the Umbra and be taken home. But in Algiers, the timing broke down. Patrols intensified, searchlights swept the water, and the harbor, disturbed by the divers' movements, became a trap. Those who swam towards shore did so exhausted, drifting on currents or hiding among rocks. Many were discovered by Allied patrols after hours in the cold. One Allied report described an Italian diver found barely conscious, lips blue, unable to stand. Another found clinging to a buoy, whispering only, asking for water. These men had risked everything and had held the harbor in their grasp for those crucial hours before dawn. From the perspective of the raiders, the mission was a success despite their capture. Multiple ships were sunk, a significant cargo vessel was sunk, 3 others heavily damaged. Allied operations were disrupted. Their sacrifice, their capture, was a price they had fully expected to pay. For the Italian Naval Command, the attack was hailed as a demonstration of Italy's continued ability to project power, even in decline. For the men of Decima, it became another entry in a long line of high-risk operations carried out with courage and precision.
Can you remind me of the date of this operation? Because the way you're describing it, I didn't fully realize how cold the waters of the Mediterranean must have been. So was it like a winter time?
It was December 10th through 11th, 1942. It was
Oh my gosh.
absolutely freezing.
So yeah, that's even more impressive on a number of dimensions, just as far as their training, their ability. Them even being able to pull this off at all was incredible. You always hear about the birth of the Special Forces, to me at least, has always been the SAS in England during this time. But clearly the training that these guys are receiving is of that caliber. I would also imagine that the defense of the harbor, there's no way they would expect anybody to be swimming in the waters in December. And so this must have come as quite a shock for them to have received this infiltration. Yeah, I don't know. I can't imagine having that kind of dexterity when my limbs are numb and I've been in freezing water for hours. This is no small task. This is pretty incredible. And I think what's interesting about the episodes that we've been doing lately especially is we're seeing it at the human level and on both sides. What are the allies, what are the sailors experiencing? What are the Axis sailors experiencing? And I've never put myself in the mind of an Italian sailor, but this is next level stuff. The dedication that one has to have to the cause has to be extraordinary to endure this kind of training and deployment. This is really exceptional and, again, something I had never heard before, so I appreciate you telling this story. Gosh, swimming in December, even in warm climates, I don't know. Maybe our Australian listeners, that's like the best time to go, but Not in the Mediterranean.
When we think about naval battles or major wartime events, we often look for the big, loud, dramatic stories. Fleets meeting at sea, dogfights over islands, or amphibious landings under fire. But the raid on Algiers, it didn't have any of that. No great battle line, no carriers, no artillery. Just silence, darkness, and the sound of explosions in a harbor that thought it was safe. And yet, strategically, the raid caused ripples larger than the number of ships damaged. Within hours of the attack, Allied naval officers were asking the question that can make any commander's stomach sink. How did the enemy get into our harbor without anyone noticing? This wasn't just a matter of embarrassment, it was fear. Because if frogmen could get into Algiers, they could get into Oran, Casablanca, Gibraltar, Alexandria, and even, theoretically, British home ports. For a moment, the Allies found themselves rethinking the vulnerability of every harbor they controlled. This wasn't just an attack, it was a revelation. Before the raid, most Allied harbor defenses focused on submarine nets, anti-aircraft guns, patrol boats, and shore batteries. After Algiers, a whole new category came into focus: anti-frogmen measures. Within weeks, Allied ports began implementing small boats, dragging grapnel nets and lines across harbor entrances. Sonar sweeps grew more frequent. To eliminate deep shadows underwater, some ports even experimented with large underwater lamps. Divers checked nets physically. Tears were repaired daily, sometimes hourly. Patrol boats carried small depth charge light grenades to drop if divers were suspected. More guards, more rotations, fewer gaps for an infiltrator to exploit. The Allies were adapting quickly. The psychology of the raid mattered as much as the damage it caused. Crews sleeping aboard merchant ships suddenly began to wonder about every splash in the water. It wasn't just enemy aircraft they feared. Now, the sea itself could hold danger. One British officer wrote, "Every harbor had become a potential front line." Stress increased, patrols increased, fatigue rose, and that's exactly what a raid like this was designed to do. At the time the Allies' advance into Tunisia was difficult. Weather was poor. Supply lines were long. Every ship coming into Algiers carried something needed at the front: fuel, ammunition, food, replacement parts, vehicles, spare aircraft, and medical equipment. Losing even one ship hurt. Losing four, including one completely lost and three sidelined, was a serious attack. Reports noted that port capacity was reduced to nearly 3 weeks, while wreckage was assessed, repairs begun, and dockside operations reorganized. Hours lost at the harbor meant delays at the front, and in Tunisia, every day mattered. For Italy, late 1942 was bleak. The North African front was collapsing. Rommel's army was falling back. Supplies were near. Allied air and naval power had begun to dominate the Mediterranean. So when the raid succeeded, Italian propaganda seized on it. Newspapers called the Decima raiders heroes of the sea, defenders of the motherland, Italy's silent warriors. The Italian Navy praised the attack as evidence that Italy could still strike at the Allies, even as the strategic tide turned. Of course, the raiders themselves were now prisoners of war, but their mission became an emblem of Italians' persistence and ingenuity. The German Navy took note as well. German commanders, already experimenting with their own sabotage units, studied the Algiers attack closely. It encouraged more collaboration between Italian and German special operations units, eventually contributing to expanded German K-Verband naval sabotage groups. more human torpedo development, and joint training exchanges. The Algiers raid showed the Axis that technical brilliance could still make a difference, even if strategically the war was beginning to tilt towards the Allies. You wouldn't think respect would be one of the outcomes of a wartime sabotage attack, but in many Allied reports, that's exactly what appears. There is a quiet, almost reluctant admiration for what the Italian divers accomplished. One U.S. Navy officer wrote after interviewing captured Decima men, "They were disciplined, professional, and resigned to their fate. We would have been proud to serve with men like that." The raid did not change the war. It did not halt the Allied advance. It did not turn the tide. But for one night, one cold, dark night in December 1942, a handful of divers in black rubber suits altered the balance in the harbor of Algiers and forced the Allies to rethink the very nature of maritime security.
Yeah, I imagine that a lot of people learned a lot of things after this raid. I'm really impressed with the initiative that the Italian Navy pursued, because to have those guys trained takes a while. And so this raid may have been planned out many months or even years in advance. Algiers is clearly a busy port, and you want to go to where the highest number of rich targets would be. And so that makes sense. And then you have to find a way to get around the defenses that exist already. And so this is a solution to that. The respect aspect, I think, is interesting. When you were talking about how the U.S. officer was describing the Italian sailor, it is very important not to underestimate your opponent and to properly gauge what they're capable of. And so once you start doing that, if you're not blinded by propaganda or just a dismissiveness about your enemy, you can learn a lot more. And I think this is probably where a lot of initial seeds of ideas came from for establishing our own special forces. Because if we could do that, if we could employ such tactics on an enemy, we would hamper them remarkably. And like you were saying, there's a domino effect. If you sabotage the shipping, all those spare parts, all those reinforced, everything gets delayed. And so you're hurting the war effort of your enemy. And on every front, you're stymieing them. And then on top of that, the psychological component you were talking about, that's almost the best aspect of this type of attack. You don't want your enemy to know what you're doing or be complacent or relaxed. And so this is precisely what would drive me bananas as if I was a commander. It's just like, you can't be scared of your own shadow, but at the same time, that's where these attacks are coming from. Yeah, this is very interesting, and I can see why so many nations took note.
When the explosions faded, when the fires in the harbor settled, when the ships were counted and the damage documented, another part of the story began. A very human part, because while the Umbra and her captain escaped into the Mediterranean darkness, the raiders who had carried out the mission had not. They were cold, exhausted, some half-conscious, and one by one they were found, rounded up, and brought ashore as prisoners. This is the chapter of the raid that often goes overlooked, the fate of the men who made it happen. For hours after dawn on December 11th, Allied patrols scoured the coastline. British patrol boats drifted close to breakwaters. U.S. Army shore patrols walked the beaches. French colonial troops combed rocky coves. Divers checked nets and hulls for any remaining saboteurs. And slowly the raiders turned up. Some were found washed on the beaches, curled on their sides, shivering uncontrollably from hours in cold water. Others were discovered hiding beneath piers or wedged between harbor rocks. A few were spotted trying to crawl onto jetties, too weak to stand. One was discovered gripping the frame of a buoy, barely conscious, unable to speak. Another reportedly tried to salute his captors, but collapsed before completing the gesture.
Wow.
These were not warriors taken in battle. These were men at the absolute limits of physical endurance. Accounts from both the U.S. and British forces showed an interesting mix of reactions. Some were angry. It was their harbor that had been struck. their ships that had been damaged, their friends who had been put at risk. But others saw something different. They saw exhausted, determined professionals who had done something incredibly difficult and dangerous. One petty officer wrote later, "The Italians looked half drowned. You could see in their faces they'd given everything. Hard to hate a man like that." Yet even with that respect, Allied interrogators approached the prisoners with caution. Saboteurs were considered highly trained, potentially dangerous, and possibly carrying information about future attacks. Before the interrogations came something else: medical treatment. Doctors and medics at the port district treated the prisoners for hypothermia, severe exhaustion, dehydration, muscle cramps, saltwater ingestion, minor lacerations, early stage immersion injuries. The irony is easy to see. Hours earlier, these men had been planting explosives beneath Allied ships. Now the Allies were saving their lives. One American medic reportedly said, "They didn't look like villains. They looked like young men who had done something impossible." Once stable, the prisoners were questioned by Royal Navy intelligence officers, U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence personnel, and British Army and Free French security officials. The Allies wanted to know a few things: how they entered the harbor, how they bypassed the nets, how many had participated, whether more raids were planned, what equipment they used, and whether any explosives remained unfound. The interrogations were described as firm, but fair. The Italians were generally cooperative. They were not ideological fanatics. They were naval professionals who understood the rules of war. Several reported expressed pride, quiet, restrained pride, and that their mission had succeeded even if their freedom had not. After the initial debriefings, the captured raiders were transported to POW facilities. Most were eventually sent to camps in the United Kingdom, North Africa, and later some were transferred to Canada. As naval saboteurs, they were segregated from general POW populations, not because they were dangerous, but because they were considered intelligence assets. Their training, equipment, and methods were valuable clues. Their treatment was generally in the line with the Geneva Conventions. They worked, they waited, and they watched their war unfold from behind wire and walls. Years later, memoirs and interviews from surviving Decima members gave us a remarkable glimpse into their thoughts. None expressed regret for the mission. They believed they had fulfilled their duty. One said, "If I had died, I would have died serving Italy. If I had survived, I served Italy in another way, by forcing the enemy to fear our reach." Another reflected on the moment he was captured. "I was not ashamed. I was proud. We had struck a blow. They treated us well. War is strange in this way." Within Italy, the news of the raid spread quickly. Though wartime censorship meant details were limited, the Italian Navy publicized the operation as a tactical victory, a heroic feat, and proof of Italian bravery and ingenuity. Their capture did not diminish the achievement. In Italy's eyes, the raiders had become part of a long tradition of naval daring. Stretching back to the Roman world, they were seen as warriors who had accepted the cost of their mission before they even set foot in the water. It may seem strange to say this, but the raid on Algiers created, at least briefly, a small bridge of professional respect between enemies. The Allies respected the raiders' skill. The raiders respected the Allies' response. And both sides recognized the humanity in each other. War separates people, but moments like this remind us that even within conflict, there can be dignity.
Yeah, I think that was very well said. I was contrasting in my mind the response of the Italian captured sailors to the Japanese troops that were captured, where it was a very different mindset. It was fanatical, like you were saying. It wasn't just a professional, yeah, this is how we do things, and this is, if I get captured, that's just part of the sequence of events, whereas it brought deep shame and was worse than death for a Japanese sailor or soldier or airman. And it's just so interesting how different societies produce different mindsets and how that's reflected in the way they operate in war. It's interesting. Perhaps it's part of our common heritage with the West, and that's why they responded the same to each other. But yeah, there's a lot to be learned in this. Clearly, more sabotage and special forces emanated from that type of training. But also, as usual, it's nice to see the reflection on the humanity of the opponent. Because I know in that war in particular, the propaganda was such that either, like the Germans made the Americans look cartoonish and like they're buffoons, like they don't know what they're doing, and American propaganda for the Axis, but particularly the Germans, was monstrous, like they were demons or devils or something like that. And so it shaped the way they fought. And for a moment, when you see that they're neither, they're professionals on both sides, and they're trying to fight for the country that they love, regardless of what the people at the top may be doing. It's interesting.
We've talked about the night of the raid. We've talked about the damage to the ships. We've talked about the Italian raiders and their capture. But to truly understand the significance of the raid on Algiers, we have to step back and look at what came after. Because the ripples of that December 1942 operation didn't stop in Algiers. They influenced how navies planned, trained, and defended themselves for the rest of the war, and long after. The raid on Algiers was not the first time Decima had struck Allied ships, and it wasn't the deadliest attack they ever conducted. But it came at a crucial moment, just weeks after the Allies landed in North Africa during Operation Torch. It proved something frighteningly clear. Even well-defended harbors were vulnerable. This reality forced the Allies to rethink assumptions dating back decades. Harbors had always been protected like castles. Big guns, high walls, nets, patrols. But Algiers showed that a single diver could slip through these defenses with the right equipment, the right training, and the right plan. Within months, the U.S. Navy and Royal Navy began incorporating new ideas into their defensive playbooks and established dedicated security teams trained specifically to detect underwater threats. These early units became the seat of post-war harbor protection forces. Algiers accelerated the development of underwater listening devices, improved sonar tuned to detect small targets, harbor illumination systems, better, stronger anti-submarine nets, special patrol craft equipped to spot divers. This wasn't theoretical, it was urgent. One flaw exposed by the raid was that responsibility for security in a harbor was often split between different commands. After Algiers, many ports formed joint coordination centers that ensure that, whether above the water or below it, someone was watching all the time. For Germany and Italy, the success at Algiers was proof that unconventional naval warfare had tremendous potential. In Germany, the German Navy expanded its K-Verband special forces. More emphasis was placed on small, stealthy sabotage craft. Human torpedoes, the German Niger and Mardar, were accelerated in development. Joint training with Italian operations. Germany had been impressed by Decima before, but Algiers cemented it. In Italy, even as the war's tide turned, the Decima's reputation grew. Their commanders saw the raid as a model for future operations, targeted, precise, asymmetric. While no one called them special forces at the time, Decima and the British counterparts, like the early Commandos and SBS, were effectively the ancestors of modern units such as U.S. Navy SEALs, the British Special Boat Service, the Italian BIN, the French Commandos Marine, and Spanish UEI Maritima. In fact, U.S. Navy underwater demolitions teams, the direct predecessors of the SEALs, studied Axis techniques after the war, including the methods used by the Italian frogmen. The DNA of these units can be traced back to operations like the raid on Algiers. Now, the raid is a study in contrasts. On paper, 16 frogmen in wetsuits should not have been able to challenge the Allied presence in Algiers. They had no surface ships, no aircraft, no artillery, no tanks, no resupply, no extraction guarantee. Just a submarine to deliver them, a few small torpedoes, and their own skill. Yet they managed to sink a ship, disable 3 others, force major security changes, influence strategy, create psychological tension in Allied ports, and gain respect even from the enemy. It was proof of what naval planners would come to call asymmetric warfare. The idea that small, unconventional forces can inflict disproportionate. After the war, both Allied and Axis veterans reflected on the raid with a sense of perspective. A British officer who had been in Algiers during the attack later wrote, "It showed us the war could reach us anywhere, even where we felt safest." An Italian raider wrote decades later, "We lost our freedom that night, but we won something else, the knowledge that we struck a real blow." These 2 statements capture the entire legacy in just a few words. Fear on one side, pride on the other, respect between both. Today, the raid on Algiers is not widely remembered as Midway, Pearl Harbor, or the Mediterranean convoy battles, but among naval historians and special operations communities, it remains a defining moment. Ingenuity under pressure, courage in darkness, precision in chaos, and the enduring truth that the sea itself can be a battlefield above and below. In many ways, the story of the raid on Algiers is less about destruction and more about evolution. It pushes navies into the future towards new technologies and new doctrines that still echo in today's maritime world.
I think this is an awesome story that, again, like you mentioned, I have never heard before, and I had no idea it had such a resounding impact through history. You don't really hear about Italian naval victories, especially in World War II. I don't hear about the beginnings of asymmetric warfare, like you said, or special forces. And this is fascinating. This is incredible. This is, I think, one of the primary reasons why we do this podcast in general. What is it in naval history that we can look at and go, oh, wow, that really made a difference in our world? And this is definitely one of them. When you think about even the raids to get bin Laden, all of that kind of stemmed from this, where young men were trained to act professionally and fight courageously in the face of certain death. And you could say that for most sailors, like many sailors are trained, they face death with courage, but this is just much more training, much more hazardous scenarios. Like they elect to go into these places, sometimes by themselves, sometimes like in pitch black, like you were saying, knowing that this could be it. And if it is, I served my country. If not, I served my country a different way, and we'll do it again. This is amazing. And yeah, I'm very impressed by those sailors that did this. And their response, it's like they took it seriously. This wasn't oh, they got lucky. Oh, this is a one-off. They'll never be able to do that again. No, they took note. They stood up and said, we cannot allow this to continue. Otherwise, our war effort could be totally derailed. And so, what a fascinating look at this event. Thanks, Dale.
As we bring this episode to a close, let's step back one final time and take in the entire picture of the raid on Algiers. Because when you lay it all out, The planning, the execution, the aftermath, and the legacy, you could see this was not a simple story of sabotage. It was a story about courage. It was a story about risk. It was a story about how war can reach into the quietest corners of a harbor and still turn water into a battlefield. On the night of December 10th, 1942, the port of Algiers was supposed to be a place of safety. Allied ships rocked calmly at anchor. Crews slept or stood watch. Supplies moved ashore to support the campaign in Tunisia. But beneath the calm surface, a handful of divers slipped through the darkness. No fanfare, no grand speeches, just men doing something incredibly dangerous because they believed it mattered. The explosions that followed in the early hours of December 11th were brief, but their impact echoed far beyond the harbor walls. The Norwegian ship Bertha settled in the harbor mud and never rose again. 3 other ships were badly damaged, their hulls torn open by charges placed with surgical precision. For their captains and crews, the raid left a memory that carried on for the rest of the war. The knowledge that even tied to a pier, a ship was never truly safe. The Italian men of Decima paid the price they expected to pay. They were captured, exhausted, and shaking from hours in the water. Yet they held their heads high. They had done what they set out to do. They had struck a blow they knew would matter, even if only for a moment. And in the strange way that war sometimes works, their captors recognized that bravery, respected it, and treated them with a dignity owed to fellow sailors who had risked everything. Algiers forced the Allies to take a hard look at their assumptions. It showed them that the war was always evolving, that the enemy was always thinking, and that the calm surface of a harbor could hide danger. The changes that followed, new patrols, new defenses, new awareness, helped protect Allied fleets for the rest of the war. In that sense, the raid made the Allies stronger, sharper, and more vigilant. In the grand sweep of World War II, the raid on Algiers wasn't a turning point. It didn't tip the balance in the Mediterranean. It didn't halt the Allied advance in North Africa. But it did something far more subtle. It forced the world's navies to evolve. It reminded them that war is not just fought with battleships and aircraft carriers. It's fought with ideas, with innovation, with the willingness to take risks in the shadows where few can see. And it showed that a handful of divers could change an entire theater's defense doctrine. Looking back now, 80 years later, what stands out most is not the statistics or the tactics. It's the human dimension. The exhausted Italian diver found clinging to a buoy. The British sailor who felt the harbor floor tremble. The American medic tending the very man who had planted the mine. The officers who, even in war, recognized courage when they saw it. These are the details that remind us why history matters, because it shows us the full range of human experience. Bravery, fear, ingenuity, compassion, and loss. Naval historians still study the raid on Algiers because it represents a kind of warfare that had only grown more prevalent. Modern navies operate in a world of drones, stealth, cyber capabilities, and small, agile special forces. But the principles remain the same. Precision can outweigh firepower. Stealth can outweigh strength. Small teams can shape big outcomes. And the unexpected can rewrite assumptions overnight. In that sense, the men of Decima were pioneers, not in ideology, but in technique. And as we end today's episode, remember this. History isn't just a list of battles and victories. It's a tapestry of human decisions. Bold, flawed, risky, ingenious, woven together in the story of our world. And on one silent night in December 1942, 16 Italian raiders carved their own thread into that tapestry, slipping beneath the waves of Algiers and changing naval warfare forever.
Well said. I think, just to echo what you said, this is a very interesting story, a very pioneering event. Technique can make all the difference in a conflict. And the way you approach something, even if you're heavily outmanned or outgunned, or you don't have the resources that the other side has, but you do have a will for victory, and you find a way. And I think that's what was shown here. I could use that in my own life in a lot of different ways. There are forces that are larger than me, but I can still persist. Yeah, it's true. But I think having the attitude of just seeing how it can be done, even if you have to stretch your mindset a little bit to say, I've never done this before, maybe it'll work, and then giving it a go. And in this case, it did, and it pioneered a whole new genre of military conflict.
Now we want to honor one of our fallen angels with the help of HeroCards.us. Today we are going to honor Private First Class Lyle Dennis Hayes. His hometown was Harding, Minnesota. Served with the U.S. Army, B Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Infantry. He received the Bronze Star, Army Commendation Medal, Purple Heart. His day to sacrifice was November 26, 1970, killed in action in Quang Ngai Province, South Vietnam. Lyle Hayes grew up on a farm near Harding, Minnesota, along with 3 brothers and 4 sisters. He loved animals, had his own horse, and, like many farm children, was active in 4-H and Future Farmers of America. He graduated from Little Falls High School in 1968. Lyle and his older brothers, along with their cousins, loved to go ice racing in old cars on frozen Vinegar Lake. Lyle worked for Eagle Construction Company and was also called upon to work the family farm as his older brothers Butch and Gerald were away serving in the military. Older brother Reinhard remembers, Lyle was always thinking of something, always had something to do. He would have been a great inventor. He could make things out of nothing. When Butch and Gerard returned home from active duty, Lyle was drafted into the Army and entered the service on May 5, 1970. He went through basic training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and infantry training at Fort Polk, Louisiana. Hayes was sent to Vietnam on October 4, 1970. Less than 2 months later, he was killed in an explosion during hostile action on November 26, Thanksgiving Day, in the mountains of Quang Ngai Province, South Vietnam. Private First Class Hayes was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for Distinguished Service in Ground Operations, along with a Purple Heart and Army Commendation Medal. Lyle Dennis Hayes is honored at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., his name inscribed on panel 06W, line 83. Private First Class Lyle Dennis Hayes, we thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take us out.
All right, no worries. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to us. I don't say this often, but Dale, every once in a while or periodically, will tell me where people are listening from, and it's so cool to know that our voices are reaching the ears of folks very far away. And I'm so glad you're here. It's fun to explore these ideas. It's fun to just learn the history and kind of see humanity through time. And thank you for joining us in this journey. If you want to contact us and talk about maybe a specific episode, maybe this episode, there's a couple of ways to do that. You can email us. The email address is usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on X Twitter. The handle is @USNHistoryPod. And we also have a Discord server, and it's super cool. And you should join it if you want to talk to fellow listeners, or hey, maybe you want to talk about other stuff. But we can talk. That's the point. You can join, and it's there. You can find that information in the show notes. Once again, if you could tell a friend, family member, coworker, classmate, etc. about us, and if you think they would like it, let them know. And feel free to rate and review. That helps us get the word out. And again, really appreciate you guys coming along.
And remember, every ship has a story, every harbor has a secret, and every night at sea has a potential for history. We want to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Bye.
Bye-bye.